Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I hope you're in a celebratory festive mood, because it's such a lovely time of the year this is, and I hope you're keeping yourself lovely and cozy and warm, and getting yourself those quintessential warm drinks, and let me know what they are, because I always love hearing from you. So before we get started with tonight's story, I'd like to tell you that it's in 2 parts. This is part 1. Tomorrow will be part 2. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I was so excited about my online house swap. I loved the sound of the warm, generous American lady on the end of the telephone called Jenna Hudson. I was swapping our home in the Scottish Highlands with the congenial American couple, who had both converted a chapel into a home in an area close to Mount Rainier. We were engaging in the house swap at an unseasonable time of the year, but then why not? Me and my husband were desperate for a change. So what if it was in the middle of winter? It would still be fun, wouldn't it? I have to tell you, Skye, you're going to adore the chapel, Jenna informed me. It's fabulous with stained glass arch windows, old pews. We converted it into our dream home. It's very special to us. I do know how you British love a bit of history attached to your buildings. Well, our home just oodles history. It sounds absolutely delightful, I'd said. I am afraid our stone house is not as ornate as yours, but it is blissfully secluded, with lochs, mountains, a plethora of fabulously wild scenery. It's over 300 years old, so it oodles history as well. I think you and I are kindred spirits, she had joked. Your home in Scotland sounds just up my street. Me and my husband Walter have always appreciated anything historic. Many people might have thought it was nonsensical for us to go and stay in a chapel in the middle of winter. After all, don't most people go on holiday in summer or spring? Or if they do go on a winter holiday, it's much more likely to be a skiing holiday in Aspen or the Swiss Alps. This was the only time of the year my husband Lachlan and I rarely got off to make our escape. We were incredibly busy in the summer months, organising holidays for other people hiking in the Scottish Highlands. So it was during the winter months that our business became quiet. This was the quintessential opportunity for us to enjoy a holiday all of our own. I loved the idea of staying in a home that was converted into a chapel. I think I'd fantasised of living in a chapel with stained glass windows and pews, or converting an old church into a home. Now for a couple of weeks we were going to live this perfect dream. Well, so I thought. I'd learnt about this app online, where you could swap houses with strangers living in other countries. It was certainly an affordable way of seeing the world, at a reduced cost. It made perfect sense to us. As being Scottish, we do have a reputation for being rather thrifty. Nothing prepared me for how remote the old chapel would invariably be. Thank goodness for our GPS, or we would never have found our way to the haunting place. The one thing I never appreciated about America was the sheer size of it. Granted, we have remote areas in Scotland, but everything in America was on a much larger scale. In my humble opinion, it made it a hell of a lot easier to get hopelessly lost. It didn't help that it was snowing fiercely, so that everything looked exactly the same, as a white world can easily conceal or obscure more distinguishing landmarks. Neither my husband nor I had anticipated being caught up in a dreadful, punnelling, whipping, buffeting snowstorm, so robustly vigorous it almost swept us off the road. In our hired truck we took several sweeping, contorted turns in our all-weather tyres, but the slippery drive was very tumultuous. We were skidding all over the place. Finally we found ourselves travelling down a curved road that led to an iron farm gate, with the name Pilgrim's Chapel. That was it. I visibly breathed in a huge sigh of relief. My heart began pounding with excitement. Oh my God, we're here! I can hardly believe it! We drove down a driveway that snaked towards the chapel, that seemed so inconspicuous, obscure and slight against the vastly imposing elements, the mountainous valleys, the pyramid shapes of the trees, that were all swathed in a glistening white carpet of snow. Oh, there it is, I said, as we parked our truck under the canopy of a snow-covered carport. For a fleeting moment, me and my husband stared in bewilderment at the Gothic church building. Its dark roof swaddled in thick carpets of bright gleaming snow, its arched, brightly coloured stained glass windows done in rich reds, blues, greens, golds, purples and yellows, twinkled in the effusive morning light. I had believed that staying in a chapel would be a romantic, almost shamanistic experience, but as I stared at the spectral atmospheric place, it seemed menacing, spooky, airy even. Was it my imagination, I wondered? I couldn't decide exactly what it was, but it made my skin crawl. A creepy chill pulsated down my spine. I had the inexplicable feeling that we were both being watched. I had been going on and on for months about how wonderful it would be to stay in this quaint, enchanting little chapel that I'd found online. A miraculous discovery that I thought was genius of me. Now I wasn't quite so sure. I was a starry-eyed romantic at heart, so to have to admit that this place was not already meeting my expectations was something I would not willingly concede to. I couldn't bear to hear my husband say, "I told you so. You're always too idealistic, Sky." He was always telling me that. "No wonder your parents called you Sky," he would tease. "Your head is always in the clouds." He was probably right, but I was keeping that to myself. "Well, here we are," I said, putting on a cheerful note to my voice, trying to pretend that I was feeling upbeat. When I wasn't at all. Lachlan had turned off the engine. His grim facial expression wore a resigned, rather solemn demeanour as he stared at the bleak, lugubrious, rather plutonian building, while the lambasting wind wailed outside, thrashing, knocking, punnelling the air, as sheets of snow were flung in long, gusty streams across the ground. This was certainly some windstorm. It was clear that neither of us wanted to exit the warmth of the truck to make our brave approach to the chapel. We both just sat there soaking up our surroundings like two reluctant sponges that would rather be anywhere else in the world than here right now. The unearthly chapel was surrounded by vast groves of ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees, all dusted in white snow crystals. But under this feisty wind they swaggered like inebriated drunks, seemingly as sinister in their demeanour as the chapel itself. It was as if their needled boughs were hammering the wind in protest to our arrival, as if they too were whispering, "Go away! Go away! You're not welcome here." Finally, me and my husband gathered our courage and wits about us, along with a couple of our suitcases. We dashed quickly towards the chapel. The moment we opened the truck door, our bodies were greeted with the punnelling gusts of freezing air. It felt like our cheeks were being slapped, burned, almost anaesthetised by piercing cold hands. We trembled, shivering with the glacial conditions, while I wrapped my icy hands in a coat pocket to keep them warm. Lachlan looked for the chapel key. I began to jump up and down on the spot, trying desperately to keep warm. My teeth were chattering. I could barely even feel my own fingers, they were that numb. Our host had told us we'd find the key under the doormat. My husband finally found it. It was an enormous heavy key, the size of a human hand, decorated with fancy scrolls. He turned the key in the lock and twisted the door handle. At first we met with some resistance, as the door refused to budge, as if something was blocking it on the other side, trying not to permit us entry. Finally my husband used his boot to kick the door. It creaked open, emitting an audible groaning sound. We found ourselves staring blankly at a dark wood-panelled entrance hall, with bronze hooks for hanging coats and floor racks for boots. We didn't take off our coats, but clutched our suitcases tightly in our hands, as if reluctant about whether we were going to stay here or not. I think we both secretly wanted to grab our things and flee, but it was far too late for that. We were here now. The cheerless entrance hall was tenebrous and gloomy. We fumbled around for a light switch, but found nothing. We then opened the door at the end of the passage that blossomed into the original chapel, as there were arched stained-glass windows everywhere. The chapel had been turned into open-plan living, as there was an L-shaped kitchen in the far right-hand corner that seamlessly folded into a sprawling living area with a huge crate where a fire had already been laid, with kindling, rolled-up paper and firewood. There were a couple of cosy, well-worn sofas next to the fire, several bespoke bookcases filled with books that lined one of the walls. Then there were some oakwood pews in the far corner of the room that faced a large flat-screen television set, probably for entertainment purposes. I noticed the original uneven flagstone floors were covered in some threadbare-looking carpets that had seen better days. I immediately went over to light the fire, as the place was so bitterly cold. I could see the vapour of my own breath before my face. "Ah, there, that's better," I said. "We certainly need a fire in here." I instantly felt warmer and brighter, as the flames crackled and spitted. Even the sheer sight of the fire brought a coziness to the room that had been absent before. We turned on the lights, but they seemed rather dim. Everything was bathed in a rather purposeful soft infusion, rather than a bright luminescent electric light. "I'll go and put our suitcases in the bedroom, shall I?" said Lachlan. "I imagine it must be through there," he said, pointing towards a couple of doors, one that had a staircase that led up to the bell tower. The other one led to an adjoining bedroom and bathroom, with a large wooden sleigh bed, 2 bedstands and a closet. It was all very simple, basic, really rather rudimentary. "Oh, there's the shopping I ordered," I said to my husband, pointing to the paper bags of shopping on the oakwood kitchen counter. There was a note attached. "Welcome to America and to our chapel home. Here are all the food items you ordered. Do enjoy your stay. Have a wonderful time. Much love, Jenna and Walter." "At least we won't starve," I said, sighing with relief, as there was no way I could envisage eating out or going shopping with the howling storm out there. "Frankly," I said, "I'm amazed we got here in one piece. There was a brief moment when I thought our truck was going to go flying over the edge of that ridge. It was touch and go for a moment." "It surely was," reflected Lachlan. "In truth, I did also wonder about whether we would have a catastrophic accident. The roads were so icy. I don't care what they say about these all-weather wheels, but our truck was skidding all over the place. The roads are so iced up." "Well, never you mind. We're here safe and sound now. At least we got here in one piece, having braved the gruesome elements. Let's face it, that's all that matters at the end of the day." "I'll put on the kettle for a cup of tea," I said, trying to maintain my positive attitude that was wearing thin very fast. There was something about this place that made me feel distinctly on edge, but I couldn't decide what it was. I had dreamed of staying in a place like this all my life, but now that I was standing here in the cold light of day, surveying our immediate surroundings, along with the stunningly exquisite stained-glass arch windows, and the fire of my blazing enthusiasm had significantly dimmed. My husband nodded. "A cup of tea would go down very well. I do fancy a brew. Anything to warm us up. This place is as cold as a morgue." "Oh, please don't say that. You're giving me the creeps. I don't want to be thinking about places like that. Not when we're supposed to be on holiday." "I'm sorry, Skye, but I'm going to say it as it is. This place gives me the creeps," said my husband, shuddering. "Have you noticed it could do with a good old dusting? There are cobwebs everywhere. I don't understand why the place wasn't cleaned before our arrival. It is very odd." I nodded. "It is peculiar." "You know why I think the place wasn't dusted?" he reflected soberly. "Why?" "Because Jenna doesn't really live here at all." "Well, why? Why would you say that? How could you possibly know?" "Think about it, sweetheart. This place doesn't have a lived-in feeling about it that suggests a couple lives here. It's kitted out for people to stay here for the standard weekend or a few days. I don't think that couple lives here at all. There would be more evidence, surely. Knickknacks, magazines, odds and ends, rather like fridge magnets on the refrigerator and cards. But there's none of that stuff here. Nothing at all. Everything is basic, with your standard run-of-the-mill equipment. No personal touches to this home that even reflect the character of the owners. If you walk into our home, for example, you can see we love animals. There are signs of our love for animals everywhere, from the dog baskets to the portrait on our wall of Rufus with a bone in his mouth. Then there's our love for art, along with some of your watercolours you painted. But here, there's none of those personal touches. Nothing." "But she told me she lived here," I protested. "Maybe they're minimalistic." "Or maybe she was being economical with the truth when she told you she lived here. Some of the dust is so thick you could practically write your name in it. It's not normal not to dust your house for months at a time. Besides, if you lived here full time, you would be disturbing that dust." My husband was silent for a moment. There's another thing about this place I discovered when I looked outside the bedroom window, when I was putting our suitcases down. I don't know how to tell you this, he said, pausing for a moment, as if he was wrestling with revealing something to me that potentially would really upset me. He began to run his hands backwards and forwards through his mane of dark hair, something he always did when he was stressed out or a little anxious. Seeing him behave like this made me all the more nervous. I began to tremble. My heart thundered in my chest. I instinctively sensed he had something bad to tell me. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he had to say. Ignorance was bliss. I was already not comfortable in this place. What was he going to tell me? I might as well hear it now, or I would be wondering what it was, and that would be more bothersome to me. "You're not going to like it one bit," my husband said, eyeing me warily through earnest eyes. "I don't care. Tell me. Don't leave me champing at the bit." "Well, there's a graveyard behind our bedroom." "There's a what?" I gasped. "There's a graveyard behind our bedroom." I stared at my husband as if he was speaking some strange foreign language that I couldn't comprehend. "You're joking. That can't be right. No one would have a graveyard in the back of their property, would they? That's crazy." "Not necessarily. It goes with the territory. You can't just go digging up graves when you buy a property, except in extreme circumstances. Given this is a chapel that was once a church, it stands to reason that there would be a graveyard here. Besides, I thought you found graveyards rather interesting." "I did find graveyards interesting, but that does not mean I want to be sleeping in one." Lachlan knew I'd had a bad experience in an old graveyard in Scotland once when I was 15 years old. The haunting experience had freaked me out. It was something that I'd never ever forgotten. The gruesome memory still haunted me to this very day. Every time I saw a grave, it would send cold shivers down my spine. You of all people should know, Lachlan, that outer-worldly, unearthly things happen in graveyards. I shuddered as the haunting, vexatious memories of myself as a young girl of 15 years old, visiting a graveyard in an old Scottish cemetery in the dead of night, came rushing back to me with a freshness and vivid recall, as if it had happened yesterday. This was an irksome memory that I'd willfully tried to expunge from my mind, but it would come bouncing back like the proverbial jack-in-the-box again and again and again. Sometimes I would wake up in a cold sweat, reliving the harrowing experience in a tauntingly graphically detailed nightmare. Like most of the 15-year-old girls in my year, we had loved stories about things that go bump in the night. Horror movies had always given us that spine-chilling, delightful, tingling thrill that we hankered after at such a young age. It had enthralled and intoxicated us, being driven to the end of our terror, like a derailed train hanging on the precipice of a cliff face. It was as blood-tingling for us as taking a ride on a roller coaster, possibly even more inspiriting. That disquieting night in Scotland had been the most terrifying night of our young lives. Of course, we'd lied to our parents, as 15-year-olds invariably do. We claimed that the 5 of us girls were going to an all-night sleepover with a friend. That was true. What no one knew was that my friend lived across the road from a large cemetery, which we intended to visit in the dead of night, in our tireless search for a hair-raising ghostly encounter. Be careful what you wish for it might just come true. I shivered as I recalled the chilling event. It must have been about 20 to 12 in the evening. We had cautiously slipped out of the back window of my friend Abby's bedroom, so as not to be heard by her strict draconian mother, who would have possibly done her nut if she discovered what we were up to. Well, that's an understatement, actually. She would have done more than her nut. She would have been totally incensed, but what she didn't know would never hurt her. Abby's mother, Mrs. McKeith, was the bossiest, most dominating and overbearing woman you could ever hope to meet, who was very religious and vehemently believed you didn't go tampering with things you didn't understand. That night all 5 of us girls carried torches in our hands, along with impassioned excitement in our hearts. We were snugly wrapped up in warm clothes, as it was a chilly night. I recall we were all wearing jeans, sweatshirts and thick anoraks. I had felt exhilarated being out in the fresh, crisp, breezy night like this. It had been dark, oppressive, even menacing, but that was the whole idea, wasn't it? We were seeking an adventurous thrill. I'd never forgotten that. Where were the stars and moon that night? They seemed vanquished from the sky. But as far as I was concerned, I didn't care. I wanted to be scared out of my skull. We all did, without exception. I was desirous to experience the same gripping thrill you acquired from those scary movies where you ate popcorn and drank soda pop at the cinema, and writhed in your seats in terror, screaming your lungs out or clutching each other in hair-raising scenes. What I was soon to realise is that reality and fiction are worlds apart. I'm afraid real fear is not so grippingly thrilling at all by any manner of means, not when you're caught up in its mist. The 5 of us girls exuberantly ambled over to the cemetery, with a vibrant skip in our step. We approached the vast iron black gates, surreptitiously pushing them open. They creaked. We giggled as we trudged down the asphalt road that meandered in straight lines around vast verdant manicured fields, bespeckled with gravestones in every shape and size, some so old they were crooked, bent over, dilapidated, swathed in moss and lichen, names worn away by time. "What do we do now?" asked my friend Esther, once we were in the graveyard. "How do we get the ghost and ghoulies to come out?" she teased. At that we all giggled. 2 of my friends pulled out cigarettes from their pockets and started to smoke, while Abby pulled out some brandy she'd pinched from her father's cabinet and began to take a swig. "Anyone want some brandy?" she asked. I took a swig. The strong alcohol burned the back of my throat. We decided to walk around the graveyard to study the stones. We curiously read several of the stone inscriptions, then sat around a gravestone to talk in the way that young girls invariably do. It would seem the subject had veered off ghosts. Now we were discussing boys. I think we were feeling a wee bit disappointed, rather flat like sparkling champagne that had lost its fizz. Perhaps all these scary movies are overrated, I thought. Nothing really sinister happens in a graveyard after all. We'd hyped ourselves up for nothing. Still, it was fun to be out here in the middle of the night, doing something we knew we shouldn't. It always felt good to be defying the parents' rules. As like typical obstreperous teenagers, we were naturally rebellious, sometimes even mutinous when it came to our parents' rules, as we tested the water and pushed those quintessential boundaries. As we were standing over a gravestone, that was when we saw him. He looked exceedingly angry as he marched deliberately towards us, swinging his arms backwards and forwards defiantly. We sensed this must be the caretaker of the graveyard. He didn't look at all happy with us. On the contrary, he looked incandescent. His weathered, wrinkled face looked contorted, his cold eyes grim and hostile, his mouth twisted down in a large scowl. I could feel my heart thundering in my chest. I knew we were in big trouble. This was a privately owned cemetery. We were trespassing. "Bloody hell," said my friend Kirsty, stabbing out her cigarette quickly, as she saw the peaked man moving towards us at a hasty speed, his rapid movements displaying the level of his affronted rage. He appeared to be gnashing his teeth, he was so peeved. You could feel the pugnacious, bristly energy as he loomed ever closer towards us. "What are you girls doing here?" the cantankerous man ranted. "This is a private cemetery. I can see you're smoking and drinking. Do you have no respect for the dead?" I remember his dark, belligerent eyes were burning with indignation as he studied us vengefully. There was something off about him, but I couldn't fathom what it was. He was wearing a long black coat. His acrid face was unusually white. "I'm sorry, sir," stammered Kirsty. "We'll get out of here. We were only having a bit of fun. We didn't mean any harm. We weren't being disrespectful. We really weren't, I promise." "Only a bit of fun, young lady. Do you realise how much work it takes to keep this graveyard in tip-top shape and pristine condition?" "I said we were sorry, sir," said Kirsten, stammering. "We'll go now." We're really sorry, sir." I'd been evading looking at the man's eyes in my shame and humiliation. It was so awful to be caught out like this. It hadn't occurred to me that there would be a caretaker on night duty. That prospect hadn't even dawned on us. That was when my eyes glanced at the man's feet. But he had none. His body ended at the end of his coat. What the heck was going on? The man that was standing here talking to us had no feet. But that was impossible. You couldn't stand with no feet. Nobody could. That was when it hit me like a brick to my head. This impassioned man that had approached us was an apparition. This realization turned my blood cold. I let out a shrill scream that startled my friends. With desperate hands, I pushed past them. I began running for my life, virtually galloping down the asphalt road. Did my friends not realize we were talking to a ghost? Kirsty apologized to the man for my absurd behavior, but amidst her apology, the man began to grow faint before her. Then he vanished, dematerializing before their eyes. My 4 friends began to scream. They too started to run behind me on the asphalt road, desperate to leave the cemetery, to get back home as quickly as they could. As I was running away, I felt a cold hand touching my back. It was so bitterly cold that it actually burnt me, almost as if I'd touched a hot iron with my bare hands. I screamed again. I do not even know how all 5 of us girls actually made it back to the house that night, as we all began fighting each other, wiggling through the bedroom as fast as we could, our hearts thundering through our chests, our breath almost faint. I remember we put the light on in the bedroom. Finally, Abby broke the awkward silence. "We just saw a ghost! Oh my God! We bloody saw a ghost! He actually spoke to us! I can't believe this happened! This really happened!" None of us could. It seemed so surreal. The next day I was to discover a dark handprint had been seared on my back like a burn. It took 2 weeks before it faded away and was gone. Needless to say, we found out who the man was we encountered. He was a caretaker for that graveyard in 1884. We found a portrait of him online. It sent chills down our spine. A week later, my friend's mother woke up to find the caretaker standing at the end of her bed. Like us, she thought he was real, that someone had broken into the house. He looked at her and said, "Stay away," and then he vanished before us. Of course, we knew that "stay away" was for us, but luckily my friend's mother never knew that. Needless to say, we never frequented that graveyard ever again, but we weren't the first to encounter the caretaker, nor would we be the last. I'm still convinced he haunts that graveyard, guarding the graves of the departed, scaring anyone off who chooses to vandalize or explore the yard, or anyone who dares to offend the dearly departed by smoking or drinking in that graveyard. Now that me and Lachlan were staying here in a chapel in the middle of a graveyard, I felt more than a little unhinged, as I knew ghosts were real. The last thing I wanted was to experience an unearthly encounter all over again. Meeting that contentious caretaker had been more than enough interaction with the paranormal to last a lifetime. "I'm sorry, I know you have a thing about graveyards," said Lachlan, "but I'm sure we'll be perfectly all right here. I've just looked at the weather report. It's not looking good. The snowfall in around this area has been very hectic. Parts of the interstate have been cut off. There's been reports of snowdrifts everywhere. They're advising people to stay indoors, not to travel. There's ice on many of the roads. There have been some serious accidents." "Oh dear," I sighed. "So we're more or less trapped. Whatever induced me to think that staying in a Gothic chapel in winter would be a good idea? I must have lost leave of my senses." "Never you mind. We're going to make the most of our time here. It's going to be fun, I promise you," said Lachlan, trying to sound reassuring. "But what about the graveyard?" "Forget the graveyard. It's going to be fine. Just because you say you had a bad experience in a graveyard once does not mean it'll happen again. In my book, lightning doesn't strike in the same place twice." "I hope you're right," I said, not looking terribly encouraged by my husband's reassuring words, but I did manage a wry smile. So that's the end of tonight's story, and tomorrow we continue with it. Until next time, goodbye and good night.